We good? Awesome. All right, everyone. I'm Riley. It's Luke, Michael, Yoshi, and Ari. This is our presentation of our game Mephisto. All right, so right off, we're going to talk a little bit about the artwork. Yoshi's going to talk about the artwork of the game board, which is was his specialty.
Yes, so this section here in the middle is probably what I took the most time on, just because I had to measure everything out, do it in pencil, and then line it in with ink. So that wound up being very time consuming because I wanted to have it be as visually clean as possible. And then once all of that blocking in was done, I could sort of relax and focus on just adding some personality and trying to make the game board look as naturalistic as possible, because I want people to be able to look at this and understand basically what different areas of the map are doing. For example, you can tell that here in the center, that's where most of the combat is going to be occurring. Whereas here on the side, that's where you're going to be doing various orders, supplies we call them, which are going to be modifying combat outcomes. Of course, once we get to these guys, they're going to fill you in on more of that. But for now, I'll just tell you why I made some of the choices that I made. So here in the middle, obviously, with the helmets, obviously only about 3 of these countries actually really deployed tanks on the field during the First World War. But Russia, Austria, and Bulgaria, I felt you could say that realistically there would be situations in which they could have tanks. Or it would be realistic for them to have stolen tanks. And then here on the side, we have these 2 depictions of officers. I really like that sort of cartoonish image that you get from a lot of parodies of the First World War of officers that are all thigh boots and spindly arms. And that's basically that. But then getting over here to the side, my favorite part. Probably wondering what the hell that is. Okay, so we named our game Mephisto, which is after the first tank, which is named after a demon, Mephistopheles from Faust. And with that decision, obviously we're going for a more lighthearted approach to this conflict because it's very brutal. But then Mephisto, it's a very metal name, I had to do something with it. So here we have basically a demon. And I wanted there to be this one element of the board where people could look at it and think, okay, yes, there's all of these other things, and tanks are cool, and this is a lot of fun, but it's the First World War, and we have to remember that at the end, this is about massive conflict between empires, a complete destruction of humanity and human empathy, and it's important to have at least something that reminds us that there's something to be uncomfortable about in this, even if we're also having fun with some of the cooler aspects of it. And I'll hand it off to this guy. I'm going
to do a little mission. So that's the first thing you're going to see when you open up your box of our game, is the metal, the sort of machinery that's the artwork invokes. So Mephisto is a tank game. It is a card-based 2-player tank game. There are several pieces, and we'll get into the rules and how the pieces work, but your pieces are going to consist of cards with tanks on them, various classes, for the Axis and the Allies. There are counters, blue and red, each have their own purpose. And then there are edit numbers, which are kind of unrefined cardboard, but they have numbers on them that you'll place on the cards, edit the cards. And of course, there are multiple dice. I believe there's five die. Yep. Those are all the moving parts of the game. And we'll go into how they work.
So for our cards, we have done this before a couple times, so we kind of knew that you don't really want to draw out every single one. It's kind of a pain in the ass, to say the least. So for construction, we took index cards, and then essentially the front is just sticker paper, printed it out, kind of formatted it on a Google Doc, and then it's kind of simple from there. You can mass produce it if you wanted to in that way. The cards themselves, we have 7 tank cards stretching from super heavy, heavy, and medium tanks, and we also have 9 support cards. So as you can see, this is an example of a super tank. We have the Tsar tank, We have a little bit of a funny quip in there, again, because we want to keep it somewhat lighthearted, even though we are covering a very intense topic. We feel that in most of our games that we've made, that you need to balance the intensity with a little bit of fun, so that way you're not kind of focusing on the extremely violent nature. You want to actually learn something and not just focus on, you know, holy crap, this is horrible. So it kind of helps, in my opinion and our group's opinion, to have, you know, just a little bit of fun in your game somewhere. The basic layout of the card is the type, then you have a picture of a tank, and then you have your values for essentially your attack, your lives, and your weight, which Michael is going to go into in more detail. And yeah, I mean, some of the things that we could expand on, which we'll cover later, but really quickly, is just adding more tanks and more vehicles. One of the issues we did run into was the fact that there is a limited number of tanks when compared to, say, the Second World War. So we kind of had to make very, very specific decisions on what tanks we were going to include and what not to include, especially with considering the use of prototype tanks that kind of just made the cut or were just outside of the cut of potentially seeing combat. So that was just something to think about.
Alright, so we'll move on to how to play the game. So to start out, I'll quickly explain the tank card a little bit more in depth. So this number is going to be your attack roll, so that's what you're rolling on your dice. Anything that number and below on the 2 die you roll. This is the amount of health you have, and then weight is factored into the attack roll of the person across from you. So, like, let's say you had a medium tank and a super heavy tank. There's a 2 at the back of the super tank, so that would get added to the front number on the attack roll, which will give you an 8. So that's where the board, that's where this will be the counters are put. So you have 2 counters for each tank. So your lives, you're going to put a counter here. You can go up to 6 with the support cards, and then your attack counter, you're going to put your there. So it's just easier to keep track of what you're rolling and looking to roll for. And to start the game, each player will take their cards, put them in their piles, and everything like that. And then when the first turn goes, you each roll to see who rolls a higher number than that person is going to go. And then to start it, you each draw 4 tank cards, 2 support cards, and you discard a support card before anything happens. You just decide which one you want to keep. And then you place your first card at the same time as the other person in slot 1. So each of you are going to put it down face up in slot 1, and then put down your other 2 cards in slot 2 face down. And once that happens, then the game will start. You put down your support cards, and then you decide what has to happen with each support card. What like each one has an effect, and then you just have to figure out which effect it is. And then you go on to the rolling. So that's where you will roll the die, and you will then decide if it was a hit or not, and then this counter is going to move down each time if you get hit or not. And no matter what, you don't cancel out any hits, it's just automatically taken and moved. So there is an advantage if you're first player, but we learned that it doesn't really matter. But once your tank has 0 health, you take your card off the board, so it just makes it easier, so you know you're not going to attack across. And you can only attack the tank across from you. You can't just keep going along blind. And then once you win a round, this is what this is for, is a round counter. So you put your markers, which one you did. First of 3 is the winner. And that's about it for the playing.
So the significance of having the first card, tank card placed face up and the other 2 face down is because there's specific support cards that have to deal with intelligence. And when you choose your tanks out of the 4 cards that you draw from your shuffled deck, you discard 1, you'll have 3 tanks to play per round. You'll repeat that process per round also. There are support cards. There's a support card called air support. So when you both place your cards face up, you both see the opposing tanks, but these 2 are face down, and if you draw air support, you can actually, as the central powers, shift your tanks, because your Entente opposition will have to flip their cards face up, show you the configuration that the tanks are in, so you can actually put the tanks facing and dueling which tank that you would prefer to have facing the other tank. So that's the significance of having 2 cards face down. So the reason we did this game on tanks is because well, first off, I love tanks, but it's also a very yeah. They've been beating on me about that one. I just love tanks. I don't know what to tell you. But it's a really it's a significant portion of the First World War. Tanks were not fielded in massive stages, massive amounts from the Central Powers comparative to the Entente. That's why it was a little difficult choosing some of these tanks. There's some goofy ones in there, like the K-Wagon was. There was only 2 ever partially built, and then they didn't even throw any weapon systems on them. They used them as troop transports at the most. And the only tanks that Germany ever made were the A7Vs, and there was very few fielded. That's why there were so many compromises that Ari was talking about, where there's interwar period tanks, and there's Bupanzers, there's Whippet Bupanzers, and that just basically means stolen tanks. Because what the Central Powers had to do is, and you see this with our card, which is just an identical picture of the British tank, but with an iron cross on it, they would steal tanks. Captured tanks would be repurposed, they would be rebuilt, and then German tank crews would be trained on British tanks. Additionally, the namesake of the game is very significant. Mephisto is the it's named after the German demon. The tank, we named the game after the tank, which is named after the German demon. Mephisto is the only surviving A7V in existence to this day. It is currently residing at the Queensland Australian War Memorial Museum in Australia. The story is really, really significant. Mephisto's last battle was at Villers-Bronteau, and it was actually stolen by an Australian regiment, who went behind enemy lines and snagged the tank and brought it back behind friendly lines, which is an astonishing story. And of course, we also want to, another very significant portion of the game is the support cards. There's numerous support cards. They all have pretty descriptive photographs on them. Like this one's a machine gun. We show how various units and aspects of this modern war affects direct tank warfare. Our game is a dueling game, but that doesn't really stop us from showing that there are many other units fielded at the same time.
All right, so further development. Obviously, our game isn't perfect, but there's some things that we'd probably like to incorporate if we were to, delve into it in the future. One of them being probably altering the chips to being 3D printed. I think a good idea would probably be to 3D print the chips into a little Monopoly size game piece that's like a tank or something. These are just cardboard wrapped in duct tape as of now. Printing the game board onto a mat, also something like you guys are seeing in the war games that we play in class, something like that, just a little bit more engaging all around. Use actual hard stock card material as well. Like Ari said, we're just using paper and note cards for our cards, and adding more tanks and support cards could also happen as well. As there's plenty of stuff that we could add. There's more to more stuff involved in World War I than what we incorporated. One of those is armored cars. We can incorporate armored cars and maybe include a little bit more detail about the tanks individually on each card. Just a little bit more information about them.
That's it.
That's it.
Any questions for them? So what was your biggest inspiration to make your game?
I think it was just because I really like tanks.
I mean, in terms of the play style, like, was there a game that you played from Dr. Kocho-Williams' cart that kind of spoke the most to you to make the game play the way it is?
I think
I'll answer this from the fact of it started out as like we were thinking war, and then we were thinking of point system like cornhole where things are going to get canceled out and stuff like that. But then I remembered a game we played in World War II that was a 3-card based game, and it was a little bit like more like this, where there's like a battle like across from each other. But like that one, you were able to move the cards around. We just wanted to be fixed on just cross battle. So
by war he means like the card game,
like the card game,
the
war,
dueling
but yeah.
game, because that's you see a lot of aspects just placing cards facing each other on this game. And also we really brainstormed a lot of the previous games that these guys have made in this class, and it was almost Hazard 2.
I feel like another thing is too, like the tanks themselves are probably one of the more interesting things as far as the action goes in World War I. It's like one of the first times we see like real large heavy artillery in warfare, so it's kind of fun to do.
So a lot of the tank knowledge is outside knowledge.
Yeah, definitely. There wasn't a whole lot of research that needed to go into it. Definitely finding which tanks worked took forever because there's various different classes, and we went through a series of different playthroughs. You see there's heavy tanks, there's medium tanks, and there's super tanks. But there's various, of course you're going to play different combinations, so we had to play through basically all the combinations to make sure nothing was overpowered or really broken.
I don't know if we have the card in there, but there's actually one card that I marked out like 5 times, like
Yeah.
changing numbers because it was just not working. It was too overpowered.
Was
Like,
it mud?
literally- No, well, mud was yes the most broken.
Mud is broken.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Also, what was also really difficult, and we did have to do a little bit of research on, was finding which tanks we were going to actually name the cards as and have photographs on. So A7Vs, land ships like Mark Vs, things like that, they're pretty simple and everybody wants to see is our tank. But the Axis tanks, besides the A7Vs, they're almost non-existent. So like this one is interwar period, so that one, we were on the fence about it. And then there was a lot of tanks that were also cut out, because there's a ridiculous amount of Allied tanks. We cut out a bunch of Chars. A Char 2C was going to be another Allied super tank, but we can't have more than one Allied super tank and not have more than one Axis super tank, right? So that's why we cut out a bunch of stuff.
All right. We should wrap up because we've got to move on to the next group, but we can ask that one afterwards. Thank you, that was awesome.
Our game is called Mud. I'm Elijah. This is Ryan.
So what is Mud? This is a very large board style game. It is a attack defense style game where between 2 and 4 players are able to play against each other, trying to control trenches along the way and get to the other side of the board. And it is based around trench warfare, which was a common aspect of World War I.
So why trench warfare? Well, World War I is very commonly known for trench warfare, and we wanted to reflect the sort of back and forth balance of trench warfare, as well as you don't know what your opponent is going to do. They could do anything. We wanted to sort of simulate the slow trench crawl, being it takes you a lot of men to take a few feet, and then your enemy pushes you back, and you got to start over again. So the game board is 18 by 36 spaces. We created it in SolidWorks because we're engineers. We laser cut it in the makerspace. There are 3 trenches on the board. There's one on each side and then one in the middle. There's a compass rose on the side, and we wanted to make it pretty large so that you could have room to maneuver around your opponents, sort of give opportunities for players to flank each other, and try and get around, see what you can manage.
So how does the game work? There are 2 squads per side. Squads down there represented by blue tokens and red tokens up top. Each squad consists of 4 basic units. There are 4 different basic unit types, and every squad has one of each of those types. Each squad will be able to roll for battle power using 2 dice. The sum of those dice is the squad's battle power for that squad's turn. Battle power is what allows you to move within the game, allows you to place other specialty cards, allows you to do a multitude of other things to pretty much push your enemy back. When your basic unit reaches the trench, you are able to obtain a specialty card. Every basic unit can reach a trench once and obtain 1 specialty card. The more trenches you go along, the more specialty cards you get. Specialty cards include like artillery, gas masks, barbed wire cutters, a whole lot of aspects of what you would see in trench warfare to give your side the advantage. The specialty cards are player-based, so every specialty card is given to a single squad and not the entire team. This allows for the back and forth kind of attack/defense. So in this case, 1 blue squad would be able to roll and move and make their turn. Next, it would go up to one of the red squads. After that, it would bounce back down to the other blue squad, and finally return back to the final red squad, and that would be considered the end of a round. At the end of each round, you are drawing a new random card. These random cards include weather and wind direction. Weather is an interesting concept within the game, hence the name MUD. We decided to incorporate aspects like rain, fog, snow, and clear days. Rain makes the entire battlefield muddy. Your movements are brought down by half, and if units are within trenches, they get stuck because mud likes to collect in trenches, and that's what you see common photos of in World War I. The end game is the first person to maneuver a basic unit to the other end of the board and hold it there for the remainder of the round does win the game. The biggest part about such a large game is trying to balance the rule book. So right now, it has had multiple iterations. As you can see, it is quite a few pages. Most of the rules within here are very simple. It is large text, but we wanted to make it as detailed as possible as we found more and more of these small little moments within the game as playtesting that we needed to change.
So for the card design, you can see here a advanced unit, a weather, and another specialty card. And for the specialty cards, you have how much battle power they cost, as well as any stats or effects that each card has. So here you see the weather is rain, and units will get stuck.
So these are the basic units. You have infantry, close infantry, HMG, and a sniper. These were pretty much your grunts on the ground, moving up through trenches and trying to control other trenches. Usually in World War I, you would send, or generals would send waves of people armed like this, just trying to move forward to trenches, similar as what the players are trying to do right now in order to push the other opponents back up towards their side of the board. As for specialty units that are obtained when the basic units reach a trench, you have a tank. All of these units are based around their World War I counterparts. So tanks, they're slow, they can get stuck easily, they can get stuck in a trench if it is raining, and they cannot get out. But they are an intimidation factor, so they are able to eat up rounds. The tank has to take damage 3 times before it is removed from the battlefield, and therefore you can just kind of shove it up on the other side of the board and use it to help control an area. The plane, World War I, they were specifically used for reconnaissance. Towards the end, they were dropping bombs from them, but in our aspect, it is purely reconnaissance. If your plane is within an adjacent tile of another enemy unit, your units are able to see that unit from 1 tile further. Same thing with artillery. Artillery was mainly controlling aspect. It has a much larger range. You're able to shell specific areas to be able to inflict damage upon other enemies, as well as possibly your own friendly units, as it has an area effect. Same thing with gas. That's what the wind direction cards are for when you are drawing weather-specific cards throughout the game. The gas is more of a controlling aspect, but your units are able to take damage. It is controlled by the wind, so with no wind, it creates a 3x3 area of effect, but with wind, it is a directional 1x5 area. So if you happen to be downwind from the time that you go from a no wind to a wind effect, you could take damage as a friendly or an enemy.
For the game pieces, also designed in SolidWorks, we had them 3D printed in the makerspace, and we have 2 colors, one for each team, but during the play tests, several of the players expressed that they would rather have 4 colors, one for each squad, as it gets kind of confusing when you have 4 things of the same color and they're 2 separate squads.
So going back to the rule book, we tried to create as simple visual aids as possible. Everything's broken down precisely with a few small quips in there, such as the dynamite stick, like who doesn't like a stick-o-boom. It is broken down into multiple sections, so if you ever need to reference a specific section throughout the game, you're able to pull from that section and pretty much look up the rule directly. So upon making this game, we want to have a group of people being able to play it. So you could play it as a 1v1, a 1v2, or a 2v2 based off of the amount of squads you control. So one player can control both squads. 2 players could play against 1 player, where 1 player controls 2 squads while the others control their independence. Or as we played it for most of the time, it was a 2v2 where each player controls an individual squad. We found that this game can take anywhere between 1 and 3 hours to play, as it is the kind of stalemate design. You could have a very large push to begin with, but you can be very quickly pushed back to your side of the board. Knowing the rules of this game and just knowing pretty much battle powers, attack ranges, all those simple numbers of the game are key to making the game move along smoother, and that definitely decreases the time. We did want to rate this game age 13 plus because it does require basic math skills, addition, subtraction of dice, but it also has the warfare aspect. So you are fighting, you are using warfare terms like artillery, gas, infantry, so we gave it that rating. And what we found out is people who like luck-based strategy games will enjoy this. So it doesn't mean that there are strategies to this game, but your luck is decided based off of the dice that you roll. So your dice could dictate how your turn goes and how you're able to defend yourself or attack others.
So this is a picture from one of the play tests we played with a group of our friends. Over the course of the play test, we continually balanced the game as some units were stronger and had to be taken down. This is from before the pieces were printed, so we just printed them out on paper. We collected feedback and made changes each time, and overall, our friends enjoyed it very much. We had a lot of fun playing.
So the inspiration from this came from the Cardo games, namely Diplomacy, Western Front, and Dogfight. Diplomacy, the large board was a big wow factor when we pulled it out of the box and played it as a group. So we like that kind of, this is going to be a good game for a large group. Western Front, we like the number versus number idea in the playing cards, where it is based on the number that you play that dictates your attack/defend. In Dogfight, we like the weather aspect specifically, or the teams of 2 trying to work together. The weather kind of interfering with how the game plays does bring in that sort of factor that you don't know what's going to happen next.
And in high school, I did make a board game for a class, and we sort of gathered inspiration from that, where it was a board that you were moving across to the opponent's side, as well as some of the combat systems are shared between them. So for a production variant, that would include actual cards. Obviously, we just printed them out on paper. We were thinking of maybe laminating them, but we were making a lot of changes, and so we didn't want to have to reprint and then relaminate cards several times. The game board, we love the laser cut aspect, but we had some problems. Some of the pieces are a little warped, and they don't all fit together. They move around a little bit. So production game board would be either printed and folding, or we would redesign the connections between the boards. And obviously 3D printing is great for prototyping, but not as good for production runs. So we would have injection molded pieces. And that's it.
Any questions?
Did you guys, since you really like the focus on the weather aspect, did you ever contemplate going a little further with the planes and having weather affect them, like in specific?
Yeah, so one of the weather effects you can get is fog. That pretty much eliminates all aspects of what a plane is able to do. because when you're looking at the ground in foggy conditions, you can't see anything. We could tailor other weather effects to affect the conditions of planes and other units. That's why we have been making multiple iterations. We're on version 5 of the rulebook and trying to balance things out. Hence why we're also printing out things right now and not laminating them.
Well, it's great to see you going through the iterative processes here.
Thank you.
And
It was
also-
a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the design process, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, no, it's awesome, fantastic.
All right, so hi everyone. Good morning. So I, along with Will and Matt, we made trenches and truces. So tell a little bit what this game is about. We went more of the direction with how to get the materials to your base. So in a war, you need ammunition, you need food, you need water, you need things to build the actual trenches, like barbed wire, sandbags, medical stuff. So we made this game where you have to go around the board and get all of those materials to your base in order to fight the war. So we incorporated that. We have obviously the two teams or sides of the war, and our big thing was this line right there is logistics wins wars. Like I said, without these things, you can't even fight the war. You won't be in the war. So we went a little bit of a different way than everyone else here. So hopefully you guys enjoy this.
So there's a little bit about our inspiration for this. So I'm actually a supply chain logistics major here, so I had previous knowledge of this topic, and we were struggling to figure out one. I had taken a class on logistics, and we actually had a war section on it, so I figured might as well make a board game, kind of make it as general as possible, try to get some knowledge out there about something that a lot of people don't really understand or know a lot about in war. And our inspiration for the game, we modeled it off a combination of two very common board games, I'm sorry, Monopoly. We fell victim, the three of us, is the Cardo games. We picked probably the 3-4 most complicated games there, so we were us trying to figure out the rules and stuff, so we figured let's try to keep it or try to use it off board games everybody understands already, and so this way we could have a larger group of people understand it quicker and have a lower age target so more people can actually understand how important logistics are in war. And obviously we added our own elements and designs for it to be more relevant towards the class and towards our topic that we chose.
Alright, so our game mechanics. This is our game board, and it's a very stylized map of the Western Front. So players, it's a 4-player game, and you split up into 2 teams. You've got the Allied Nation powers, and you've got the Central powers, and you play diagonal to your teammate. So you get your 4 chips, your the ammunition, food/water, medical supplies, and trench materials. And your game pieces start here, and you can only move onto the colored spaces in front of your start base. And then you move clockwise around the game board until you can get back to your respective trench, and you can only move up into your trench once you get to your colored space. And then in order to make it safely back to your base, you have to roll that number on the dice to make it back. So if you're in the second spot here, you have to roll a 3 in order to successfully bank your piece into the base category. So in order to get out of start, you have to roll either a 1 or a 2, and then you can move one of your pieces out onto the game board and can start moving it around. After that, if you roll a 1 or a 2, you can either choose to move that piece that's already out there 1 or 2 spaces, or choose to move another piece out, depending on how you want to play your strategy. So these green spaces are our chance spots. So moving around the board is dictated by the dice, but also moving is dictated by the chance cards that you can pull if you land on these green spaces. And then you can go to the next one. So these are a couple examples of our chance cards that can either move you forward or backward, or give you a couple nice power-ups. Like a line shift, you can choose an opponent piece and swap them you know, if they're in a better position to you than to your own trench, then you can swap them. Or trench warfare, you have to lose your turn because your troops hunker down into the trenches. My favorite part is the trench camouflage card, which is there are 4 or 5 of them in the deck of chance cards. It's almost like a get out of jail free card, but in the aspect that you can, once you draw it, you can hold on to it and deploy it once you feel the need to. So in that one, if you're coming around, if you go back to the other one, yeah, if you're starting here and you're over in your teammate's corner, and let's say an opponent piece is behind you, when they roll the dice and they can land on your spot, they knock your piece back to start. But the object of trench camouflage is if you're in your own corner, your teammate's corner, and you have that card, it allows you to jump in your teammate's trench for a turn, so that the enemy piece behind you doesn't have a shot at knocking you back to start. So it gives you a little bit of strategy there, and it allows you to hide for 1 turn, and then you can move back out, you know, with a roll of the dice to move back along the game board. And yeah, I think that's
So a little bit about our target audience, the complexity of the game, and actually the time it takes. So our target audience, like you mentioned before, we try to keep it very simple. Want to get a lot of people to play. You don't necessarily need a background in history or anything to understand the game. There's no a super complex set of rules. It's just kind of like in everybody's game. Sit down at the table, play with a bunch of your friends. So our target audience, we set around like ages 12 plus. And it's more for people who actually want to understand battle war logistics and just kind of get an idea of how important and how war actually doesn't happen without materials given to them. The complexity, like I said, very low. It's very similar to popular board games. Like I mentioned before, it's designed this way on purpose. And the time it took, it kind of varied anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes. It all kind of depends on how much you're moving backwards after you move forwards. So it's pretty variable there. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in our improvements, how we can kind of change that or increase that. So some of the improvements that we saw fit would make this game better. Obviously, design 3D printed board pieces. We were struggling to come up with designs that were actually 3D printable. We're not necessarily the most, none of us are engineers, so we're not the most technically designed people in the world. I want to increase the board size, so if we could add a couple more trenches, so to speak, so we could add more players, more teams, I think that would be a good element to add and kind of get a more banter and more people actually play the game. This would also increase the time or length of the game. And another big thing that we noticed was the change in severity of the chance cards. So as we were playing it, we found that some of the cards move you a little too far forward or a little too far backwards. We could change these, allow for more strategy and more chance to knock your opponent back to start. That was another big thing we saw. There was kind of a lack of strategy, so to speak. It's kind of a chance game. So I think if there was the ability to add a little more strategy, a little more technical knowledge as you play the game in order to give that for your advantage or use it to cause your teammate a disadvantage. I think that would actually add a very interesting element to the game, something unique to our game that I think would hopefully make it a pretty decent board game. So that's all we got.
Yeah, you want to make a few tweaks there before Hasbro's legal department.
Yeah.
On top of you over the intellectual property rights. But yeah, I mean, there's this thing to build off there and tweak it. Any questions?
If you did 3D print the pieces, what would they look like?
I feel like we could design them in a way that they would represent their individual supply that you would be supplying to the trenches. You know, the ammunition one could be like a little ammo box, or the water one could be
Canteen or something.
Yeah, something like that, or a sandbag or something like that, just to represent the supply that you are moving around the board.
First off, I love the theme. Like, this is great. Loggies are often overlooked, but there's no combat arm without loggies. So
Thank you.
But I know you guys are business and supply. Is there any historical inspiration to doing like a logistics theme?
Honestly, no, there's no specific event or anything. It was literally just I had some background knowledge from a prior class and said, hey, this is really important, and
That makes total sense.
listening to people talk about it, like nobody really talks about it, or listening to people talk about their own projects, nobody really talks about it. So, hey, let's try to kind of come up with a different idea or something different for people to see. So That's all it was. There's no specific event or anything.
It's definitely something we can add to the improvements if we want to make it a longer game or,
Right,
you know,
like
the
you
game
can
work.
make it more historically technical or.
Take a look at Race to the Rhine. It's a World War II game. It's highly about logistics.
Okay.
Which is, might give you some other ideas as well.
Perfect.
Thank you.
All right.
All right, I'm Peter,
I'm Nate.
and this is our game, General's Orders.
You can see the title.
All right.
General's Orders.
Yeah. So we're gonna have this standing up as soon as I talk about like how to play the game, and then I'm just gonna lay it down so that you can actually see the presentation. So the basic concept for General's Orders is to capture the enemy's headquarters, and it's just a basic 1v1 type of game, and using 3 types of cards: unit cards, event cards, and order cards. You pretty much work from one side of the board, meet in the middle, battle it out, and then just try to capture the headquarters or have them lose morale, which we will get to in a minute. So, laying that down. So just a couple different types of unit and order cards. To the left, we have the unit cards. This is what you're actually using to fight the other opponent with. You got your basic infantry, tanks. There's also artillery. But intro to the cards, you got the red circles, which is your attack points. That's how much damage you can do to an opponent. Blue square is how much damage you can take before being, wiped out. And the yellow circle up top is your, that's like the cost to put it on the board, which we will get to in a minute. It's what we would call like the war bonds, which is just the economic unit that we used. And to the right is just different orders that can happen. So you would have your own specific ones, and I guess taking strategy into it, you would just deploy them whenever you'd feel like you need like an extra boost or whenever you're about to attack.
Yeah. So and some of these cards will come with their own text to them, which makes them unique, and you'll start to see the effects fleshed out as we go through more of the mechanics. The third type of card we have are event cards. These are just sort of like random chance cards in Monopoly. If I could speak to the art style momentarily, Microsoft Paint was really helpful because it was easier to mass produce, and I really couldn't figure out any of the online card makers. But event cards, sometimes they can be specific to World War I, like Christmas Truce. Sometimes they're just kind of standard, like things that would happen on the daily in a war, like operating at night. You can see its unique text is you have a chance that your attack falls flat. There's confusion. R&R, troops need to go behind the lines, get rest. Or other unique things like Turnip Winter, which we went over in class. And these are just further examples. We tried to add some variety into the game, so we have different types of units that may not always be touched upon in World War I games. You've got your standard artillery barrage that kind of comes in any war game, and just other orders, so trying to spice things up. Oh, does this need to? Or is this
I can take it.
okay.
So as I was saying before, your economy, that's just the war bonds are just the unit of economy. Each turn you're given 10 war bonds, which is just 10 movements, and those generate back, like they start out at 10, and then you go through your turn back down to 0. Next go around you start back with 10. So yeah. Deployment and movement. The cards start out kind of similar to chess, where they start at the polar opposites of the board, and then you kind of work your way in the middle. Standing this up again just a little bit. So you can move vertically or horizontally, and you can't attack at a diagonal. So how you would take, I guess how you would remove another unit from the opponent's board would be kind of have to surround them a little bit. And some like kind of, I guess, strategic components of the game is kind of shown with this tank card. It takes a little extra orders or a little extra war bonds to be able to move it because it's heavy, it's expensive. That's kind of the point that we're trying to convey here.
Yeah. So one of the balancing decisions we made is that bulkier units, like a tank compared to an infantry, we can't have them all be the same movement cost because that would just kind of be unfair to have too many bulkier units moving quicker than your standard infantry. So we would have balancing decisions like has +1 movement cost, so it would cost 2 war bonds to move, to just tanks are higher maintenance, they break down.
In addition, we got these little squares printed out, and these kind of represent entrenching. And another thing is that infantry units, they can entrench, and what that would do is it's a little extra cost, but it gives you a little extra protection against an attack. So.
Yeah. The idea with those would be, if I could stand the board up again.
Yeah.
In the beginning of the game, kind of like at the start of the war, once you positioned infantry cards how you want them, you could kind of create a string of trenches to sort of set the board up how you want to, so you can defend things properly. In terms of unit combat, we didn't try to reinvent the wheel here. It's probably nothing you guys haven't really seen before. As Peter broke down earlier, there's the attack stat and the defense stat. When two units are engaged, you can attack from any like Cartesianal direction, so up, down, left, right. If you're adjacent, you can attack the unit. You would compare the red stat to the defender's blue stat, and if the red stat is bigger, obviously you destroy the unit. If the blue stat is bigger, then the defending unit sticks around and it can attack next turn. So when a unit's destroyed, it subtracts from a morale total, which we'll get to on the next slide. And obviously, if you get enough units destroyed, your morale goes to 0, and we'll talk about that. The only other caveat with unit combat is after a unit's destroyed, we decided that you can replay the unit once for double the cost. So like that tank on the bottom, it costs 4. If it got destroyed, but you really need it, you could redeploy it for 8. But the idea is it's a bit of a gamble because that's pretty much your entire turn.
Yeah.
If you wanted to get that unit back out.
So yeah, basically, if you're losing enough battles, it'll cost you double to put the same amount of units and pieces on the board, and so eventually you can put those same pieces back on the board, but you won't be able to move them around. So if you're losing a lot either way, they're going to either capture your headquarters or run out of war bonds, and without having a chance to do anything with them.
As for morale, as we mentioned, we decided on like a static total to start with of 25 morale points. As you lose troops, it decreases by 1 for each loss unless someone has played an order or there's an event card that has sort of modified that total. So as I mentioned, orders and events can augment the amount. Once a player's morale hits 0, this is kind of our way of hard stopping the game so it doesn't go on forever if there's a stalemate. So once it hits 0, they would generate -1 war bond per turn. So next turn it's +9, +8, +7. And once you hit 0, you can't really do a whole lot with your cards. So you eventually just get overwhelmed, and that's pretty much it for you.
All right, turn structure, kind of went over that in the beginning, but you pretty much start with the setup. You can have them set up in almost any order that you want, and then the next 3, troop deployment, movement, and combat, pretty much happen interchangeably. So there's no set order in how that happens. It's just whenever you feel like you're in a good enough position to attack, you go forth with that. And winning conditions is, as I stated before, capturing the headquarters or morale loss and economic loss. And how you would actually capture a headquarter is surrounding the headquarter with your own troops on at least two of the sides. So
yeah. So we have like 2 grid squares here. You would have 2 infantry surrounding it.
Yeah.
That would signify that the headquarters has been captured.
Yeah. So some of the inspirations from this game, a little bit of it came from Steel Inferno. That's kind of how I got the map. I like the map setup of it. It was very realistic. But one of the big drawbacks was incredibly long to play, a lot of rules, and just a lot of moving components around. And after like somebody bumped the table, half of them either went off their square or completely off the table. So then it takes you about half an hour to set up the board. Just adding in like 15 minutes of resetting up the board after it gets shifted around. That kind of got annoying, so we just want to keep it minimal. And that's another thing that we took from Trench Wars. It was just a basic card game, not a lot of moving parts and components. But one of the limitations to that, it was very narrow on its like the whole concept of the game. Just focused on just straight military. Kind of wanted to bring in a little bit more morale and economic side into it.
Yeah, and that's where chance and morale kind of came from. We played the Grizzled, which is more of a card game that's based around teamwork and kind of luck of the draw. So what you get is what you have to work with, and that's where like our event cards came from and where the morale points came from. And I guess the whole kind of like inspiration for making the game in this scale was to try and find a happy medium between trench war and
as outsiders to wargaming, we saw games like Steel Inferno as at first kind of like almost offensively complicated. So we wanted to find a game that could be played in a little under an hour, but still have enough unique components that not every game is exactly the same.
Want to do, I guess, just enough so that you can get the point, like the World War I concept through without having to remember all the caveats in the middle.
Yeah, so our main goal was what we thought someone could take away from this game is by adding a lot of the things that we learned in class into the game as cards. So like you saw earlier, go back a few, like Defense of the Realm has its own, it was a British Parliament Act? Was that what it was at the time? Okay. So yeah, British Parliament Act, and it had its own unique flavor in the game. So it was an act against espionage, so you'd play your next 3 units face down so your opponent doesn't know what they are. So certain things like that are how we tried to add a little variety to the game. Drip rifles, another example, that was a very specific one-off sort of thing that happened in Gallipoli. The British soldiers wanted to escape their trenches, so they pretty much jerry-rigged I think a fuel can to a rifle so that when it dripped enough fuel, it would fire a shot to make them think they were still in their trenches. So the idea was we wanted to have anyone be able to pick up this game and play it, but at the same time, once they were done, we wanted them to be sort of interested in the topic and maybe see a couple cards that they go, I didn't know about that. Let me go on my phone and Google it and, maybe spark an interest in the topic that would last a long time. I'd say for further production and taking the game further, we kind of wanted to scale up the board, but for production reasons, that was just starting to get unfeasible. Card production, if I had more money in my pocket, I'd probably print, fancier cards that weren't MS Paint. But, yeah.
All right.
Fantastic. Thank you.